So I'm delighted to really be here today with Lisa, Carey, and I chairing. I'll be on virtual. Carlos Artiego, I think, is there as well. And I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Cliff Hudis. I think many of you know he was the chief of the Breast Medical Oncology Service at MSKCC, president of FASCO, and then transitioned to CEO of FASCO. But most importantly, has been such an amazing mentor and collaborator to many. And over the years, we've had numerous discussions about his unique personal journey. And I think many of the people on the panel today also. And I'm delighted he's accepted the invitation to share some of these pearls, because I think there's a lot that us as academics can learn about these different roles and how we potentially can change the way we structure things. So thank you so much, Cliff, for coming down to San Antonio for this special session.
Great. Thank you very much, Rebecca. It is lovely to see you. Sorry that we're not in person. And I want to thank you for helping to organize this and for thinking of me for this session. I spent a little bit of time thinking about what I would talk about. Let's see, where would I see my slides if I wanted to see them?
Can you guys tee up the first set?
There we go. Okay. So there we go. So I spent a little bit of time thinking about this session. I spoke to Rebecca and a few others. I am deeply respectful of, even in awe of, the accomplishments and impact of so many of the people who will be speaking after me on this panel and actually throughout this entire meeting. I do not intend to provide a guide to how to build an academic breast medicine program. Not at all. I hope to instead talk a little more broadly about the role of a leader, about leadership, contrasting it with management, and more. And so I start by taking the title of the session, Learning by Leading, the Lessons Learned. And I want you to look at the photograph, which I took from my bedroom window back in April. There's a person on a ladder. And just ask yourself for a moment what you see there exactly. What is that person? What is their role? What are they doing? And I'm not going to answer the question for you just yet, but think of them in terms of leaders and followers. Think of them in terms of structures, frameworks. Think of them in terms of goals and accomplishments. And we'll come back to the image, I think, a little bit later. I have no general or specific relevant or irrelevant, I think, disclosures to share, but they're all listed for you here. The little bit of work I do unpaid with Memorial, Columbia, and the Alliance in particular. All of my conflicts are available broadly and openly at the COI site at asco.org, as shown here. So when I was president of ASCO, the then CEO was Alan Lichter, the radiation oncologist, formerly dean of the University of Michigan. And he used to cut off conversations at times, or bring conversation to conclusion, I should say, by making the simple statement that what leaders do is they lead. And by that, he meant they make decisions, they take responsibility, they own the outcomes, good, bad, or otherwise, and they move on to the next issue. Standing before you, I want to highlight something that I think is a trap and a challenge in academic programs, and indeed in many systems, both in the nonprofit and for-profit world, which is much of what is called leadership in the context of structured environments is management, not leadership. You are given, assigned a set of tasks and responsibilities by somebody else. You are measured against those, and you're sometimes or often not given adequate resources, freedom, latitude, and authority to actually deliver those results. And there ends up being a lot of frustration and a mismatch, therefore, between what you're expected to do and your ability to actually do it. And that really pushes you into the category of managing. You're managing up and managing down, as you've often heard. Simon Sinek, who's a well-known business guru who's written a few books that you may have heard about, Leaders Eat Last, the Infinite Game, and Start With Why, among others, makes this point. A boss has a title, but a leader has people. How do you transition from the title, chief, chair, and whatever, to the real role of leader, which is to build affinity and devotion to some degree, but more importantly, alignment around a set of goals that leads to effective execution and accomplishment? That really is the challenge. Now, in the moments before this talk even, my fellow panelist, Matt Ellis, and I were having this exact conversation, pointing out that some people are born leaders, and that may be true, but that will not get us very far, because many of us will acquire all of the skills, technical prowess, and accomplishments necessary for promotion in our systems, and we will be assigned leadership roles, whether we like it or not. And if we were dependent on native leadership, being born a leader, for society to move forward and for us to be successful, then we would be in big trouble, in my opinion. So I would take a different perspective. Yes, some people are magnetic with their personalities. Their characteristics make them natural-born leaders. But the truth is, for the rest of us, we have to learn it. And leaders can and should be made. Here's a problem, though, that we can call out in our formal medical education, and that is that we are just not taught the basics of leadership, or management for that matter, or finance, or organizational structures. And these are real areas of scientific inquiry and study. There are schools built to teach them, obviously, and many of our friends and colleagues in our lives outside of medicine go through all of that very formally, but we in medicine are all too often thrust into positions of leadership and responsibility with essentially no formal training. We have to find it on our own. We have to have the good fortune of a mentor who knows something and can transmit it, or we have to be in a great environment that supports us and compensates for it. But it doesn't have to be that way. I would argue quite strongly that the reason a few of you, I bet, have gone and gotten MBAs, and a few of you have gotten other advanced degrees is because you recognize the deficit and the opportunity to do something about it formally. So you can learn leadership, and I would argue even more strongly, you must learn leadership if you're going to be successful. So a few things to think about. Medicine, it turns out, is a great way to prepare for organizational leadership. We just don't identify the great way overtly. It's incomplete, as I just said, because our curriculum doesn't include it, but there are other aspects of medicine that really are great. 2, strategy is really critical. You need to know where you're trying to go all the time. You can't just flounder along, and I would dare say, apologetically, to some degree, I lacked some strategy earlier in my career. I'll talk about that later. Culture matters. The tone you establish for your environment is really important. There's no such thing as over-communicating except when it's TMI. And what I mean by that, of course, is on the things that matter, repeating your messages, being very clear about it, at the same time that you're listening is really important. So the over-communication is not a thing for a leader. And you can't ever know what you don't know, which is an argument for some humility. So my personal journey, I'm not going to go through all of it, but I will say I was selected to be a chief medical resident when I was in training. It was probably my first administrative leadership role. It makes the point again, there was no training for how to do that. I was just given the title and a schedule to make and, you know, the slide projector to run and a few other things like that. Later, I went to Memorial Sloan Kettering for fellowship, and I was really fortunate there that my mentor was hired right after I came in as a fellow, Larry Norton, known to many of you. And in 1998, when Larry was rising in terms of his leadership roles, I had the opportunity to become chief of the breast medicine service, shown here at a relatively smaller size than it grew to. When I took over, it was about 11 faculty members at a single site. By the time I departed 18 years later, it was multiple sites in New York and New Jersey and about 40 faculty. Some of the faces here you will recognize. Larry was still part of that team. You all remember, of course, our friend, the departed Jose Basalga, but Andy Seidman, Shanu Modi, Heather MacArthur, Sarat Chandralapati, Maura Dickler, a large group of people, many of whom have had a real impact on our world of translational and clinical, translational research and care. I was really, really proud of the work that we did there, but I would submit to you that I was given a lot of management tasks in that role, and the leadership opportunities were more narrow. Later, as you heard, I moved personally to ASCO. I did that after having served as an elected volunteer leader, but my current role, you should know, is really quite different. The CEO of an organization is, generally speaking, the one and only hire and firing decision that a board of directors makes. The job of a board is to set strategy, not to manage an entity. And it is the job of the CEO and staff to execute and deliver against that strategy. That's the simple deal. The difference is, in this environment, you have the opportunity to identify the right people, put them in defined roles, and hold them all accountable. So my team, shown here, will be known to some of you. Sean Cozen is the CEO of Cancer Link. Nancy Daly, the CEO of Conquer Cancer. Julie Graylow, known well to this community, as our Chief Medical Officer. Chris Merlin, our Chief Digital Officer. Sybil Green, our Chief Equity Officer. Dina Michaels, our Chief Operating Officer. Linda Jensen, our Chief Financial Officer, and my personal assistant, administrative assistant, Sarah Da Silva. I mention this to say teams need to be built, they need to be collaborative, they need to know their roles, and they need to have clear and open communications. And that's something that we have built successfully over the last few years in order to try to execute at ASCO against the board's goals. But this brings me then to the second issue, which is you have to know exactly what you're talking about. And we tend to be loose and vague with business terms. There is strategy, which is the plan you intend to pursue and the goals you want to deliver. And then there are tactics, which are the things you're going to actually do. So my plan is to fly to New York tonight, but my tactics are to go to SAT and get on a flight to Dallas and connect to a flight to LaGuardia and so on. And it's worth often holding yourselves accountable, thinking clearly about what you're trying to do in terms of strategy, but then specifically what you're going to do tactically. And some of the talks that we'll hear about in our discussion, you'll see, will drift back and forth across those two things. To have a strategy, you have to have a strategic plan. The shorter, the simpler, the better. ASCO's strategic plan fits on a single page. This is it. Mission, vision, declared core values, a single overarching goal, which is to lead the world in disseminating the information that everybody needs to improve quality of care. And then you drift towards tactics. There are some specific goals that we want to achieve in order to do that. We organize our work along three broad pillars, but none of that's so critically important except the idea of having a plan. The second thing, though, is no matter what your plan is, the culture, the tone, the mood you set is going to matter even more than the strategy once it's created. It is famously said by Peter Drucker that culture eats strategy for breakfast. The components of culture are really the lives that you live together as an enterprise. What is your organizational structure? What are your rituals? What stories do you tell each other? How do you relate? And it takes a leader a lot of time and attention to establish a positive culture. So I suggested earlier that medicine was great training for all this, although incomplete. I want to just drill down on that for just a moment. You come into leadership positions with a background in medicine with a natural advantage. You're used to the urgency of now. You make decisions with sometimes incomplete and evolving information. You have to live with those consequences and the impact on people's lives no matter what happens later, all too often discovering that you might have made a different decision months or years later with what you then know. We can't be destroyed or harmed by that. We have to be able to cope, and we learn how to do it. Our decisions are semi-public in many ways. People talk about our decisions, and we have to collaborate with teams. We need to establish relationships with mentors and advisors. These are all, I think, useful. COVID was a litmus test in many ways. Thrust upon us organizationally was massive uncertainty, a rapidly evolving reality, risks that were in 360 degrees, personal health, staff health, societal health, and so on. And there were decisions required. You couldn't punt. You had to decide to be open or be closed, for example, to have a meeting or not have a meeting. These decisions were hard, they were fraught, they were expensive, and you have to live with the results no matter what. So I would close by just imploring everybody thinking about their own careers and running their programs to think about their own strategic goals. This is just a list of some. Is it altruism that drives you? Improvement in clinical care you're aiming for? Specific research, education goals, your own family life, something else? It doesn't actually matter, but what matters is that you should be really, really clear about it. Looking back, as was the charge in terms of the title, what would I do differently in breast medicine, knowing what I know now from my position at ASCO for a half decade? I would have always had, or I wish I would have had, a much narrower, tighter strategic plan. I wish I was holding myself and my teams more accountable for specific goals along the way, and I would spend more time on focused review and greater accountability in general. As a servant leader, which is really what this person is, you want to listen more. You want to always be learning. You need to surround yourself with trustworthy advisors. You have to empower your colleagues to succeed on their own. You need to, as I said before, communicate more, build consensus, and the most important thing is always know where you're headed. I want to be clear, that doesn't mean that's where you're going to end up anyway, but having a direction is the most important thing, even if you have to change it. So when I see this person on the ladder, I see somebody standing out there serving the people in that building, but clearly at the top of the building, they're standing on a complex edifice that took thousands of people to design and build and maintain. And the point is, not seen, there are people stabilizing that ladder, there are people yelling instructions, there are people making sure it's safe around them. Nobody's out there alone, even when it looks like they are. Thank you very much.